The space station hung like a lonely shadow above the barren world below. It was not a beautiful place. The walls were gray, the air recycled, and the lights flickered when the generators were tired. People lived here because they had no choice, not because they wanted to. Work was hard, food was simple, and dreams faded with time. Among these people lived David, a mechanic with grease on his hands and loneliness in his heart. He was not respected, nor was he admired. Others laughed at him behind his back. Some even mocked him to his face. David is too soft, they said. A fool. Always fixing broken things no one cares about. He helps strangers for free. What an idiot. David heard their words but never fought back. He kept his head down, working quietly in his small workshop on the lower decks. He fixed old machines, patched leaking pipes, and repaired tiny gadgets the rich no longer wanted. He did not chase money, and he did not seek power. All he wanted was to make things work again. One night when the station was half asleep, David walked home after a long shift. The corridors were dim and silent except for the low hum of the engines deep inside the metal walls. His boots echoed as he moved through the abandoned tunnels that most people avoided. And then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. It was soft, almost too soft to notice. A small cry like the whimper of a frightened child. David stopped. He listened again. Yes, there it was. A quick, broken sob hidden in the dark. He frowned. Children did not play in these tunnels. This part of the station was old, almost forgotten. No family would let their kids wander here. Curiosity pulled him forward. He moved slowly, careful not to make noise. He turned a corner and saw shadows moving near a pile of rusted pipes. At first he thought it was just rats, but then he saw them. They were not human. Small figures, thin and fragile, crouched together in fear. Their skin glowed faintly under the weak light, pale blue like frozen water. Their eyes were wide, large and bright, glowing in the dark. They looked weak, starving, and terrified. David's breath caught in his chest. Alien children. His first thought was danger. If the guards found them, they would be taken away, or worse. The station did not welcome aliens, especially now when fear and rumors filled the air. People spoke of alien hunters, strange enemies moving from system to system, leaving destruction behind. The children looked at David as if expecting him to attack. One of them hid behind the others, clutching a broken piece of metal like a weapon. Their faces were dirty, their bodies thin. David raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. His voice was soft, gentle. "It's okay," he said. "I won't hurt you." The children did not answer. They whispered to each other in a language David could not understand. Their words were fast, nervous, full of fear. He wanted to leave. Every part of him screamed to walk away, to pretend he never saw them. If someone reported him, he could lose his job or be thrown in prison. But then one of the kids stepped forward. Her eyes were too big for her small face, shining with tears. She held out her hand, trembling not in attack but in plea. She was asking for help. David's heart twisted. He saw not aliens, not enemies, but children. Lost, hungry, scared children. He took a deep breath. "Come with me," he whispered. "I'll keep you safe." For a long moment, none of them moved. Then slowly, one by one, they followed him. He led them through the tunnels, moving like shadows in the night. Every sound made his heart race. What if a guard saw them? What if someone followed? He imagined the laughter of the others, mocking him again. They'll call me a fool, he thought, but let them. He brought the children into his workshop, locking the door behind them. The room was small, filled with broken machines and spare parts, but it was warm. He gave them water, the only thing he had to offer at first. They drank quickly, desperate and thirsty. David sat on the floor watching them. Questions burned in his mind. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why were they here, hiding in the station? But he did not ask, not yet. For now, all that mattered was that they were safe. Outside, the station carried on, unaware of the secret hidden in a poor mechanic's workshop. The people would never understand. To them, aliens were a threat. To them, David was already a fool. But David knew something they did not. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness could change everything. He looked at the children huddled together, fragile and innocent, and made a silent promise. No matter what happens, he thought, I will protect them. And in that moment, the path of his life changed forever. The secret David's workshop was not much, but for the alien children, it was a safe place. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with spare wires, metal scraps, and tools that hummed when touched. A single lamp glowed above the workbench, casting long shadows across the floor. The children huddled together in the corner, still frightened, but no longer trembling with cold. David watched them carefully. They were different from anything he had ever seen. Their skin glowed faintly blue, their fingers long and thin, and their eyes were so wide that they seemed to see through the dark. They were beautiful in a strange way, but also fragile. He brought them food, dry bread, and a little soup from his own ration. The kids ate quickly, their small hands shaking as they lifted the bowls. David could see how hungry they were. He felt a pang in his chest. How long had they been wandering the tunnels? How many days without food? When they finished, one of them stepped forward. It was the same small girl who had reached out to him earlier. She touched her chest and spoke a word softly. Lyra. Her voice was high and gentle, but filled with trust. David pointed to himself. David. The girl blinked, then gave a small smile. She repeated it, David, as if testing the sound. Soon the others joined in, whispering his name. For the first time since finding them, David felt a spark of hope. But hope was dangerous. If anyone discovered the children, it would mean disaster. The station had strict rules. No aliens could stay without permission, and these kids had no protection, no papers, nothing. The guards would drag them away. The rumors of hunters and warships made things worse. People were afraid. Fear turned into anger, and anger into hate. David knew all this, yet he could not send them away. So he made a choice. He would keep them hidden. The next days were a test of patience and courage. Every morning, David went to work as usual. He fixed broken doors, cleaned air filters, and repaired leaking pipes. Nobody suspected anything. To the outside world, he was still the quiet mechanic, the fool who worked too much for too little. But each night when the station grew silent, he returned to his workshop. He brought food hidden under his coat, bits of clothing and blankets he pretended he had no use for. Slowly the children began to trust him. Lyra, the small girl, became their voice. Though her words were few, David began to understand her. She showed him a small crystal device she carried, broken and cracked. She held it out to him with wide eyes. Fix, she whispered. David took it gently. The device was alien, its circuit strange, its design unlike anything human. But he was a mechanic. Fixing things was what he did. He nodded. I'll try. He worked on it for hours, his hands steady, his mind focused. The children watched, whispering softly in their strange tongue. At last he handed it back. The device lit up faintly, glowing blue before fading again. It wasn't perfect, but it worked a little. The children's eyes shone with joy. Lyra hugged the crystal to her chest. For the first time, David saw them smile, but the joy did not last. That same night, as David walked back from the food depot, he heard two guards talking near the main hall. They say alien hunters are moving closer, one guard muttered. A whole fleet was seen near the outer colonies. Good, the other replied. If any of those creatures are hiding here, we'll burn them out. No mercy. David froze in the shadows, his heart pounding. The guards walked past, laughing, their boots echoing against the metal floor. When he returned to his workshop, the children were asleep, curled together like a family. David looked at their fragile forms, their thin faces, and felt fear tighten around his chest. They are just children, he thought. But if the others find them... He clenched his fists. No, he couldn't let that happen. The next days grew more dangerous. Once a neighbor knocked on his door, complaining of strange noises. David smiled and lied, saying he had been testing old machines. Another time, a patrol walked close to his workshop, the sound of their boots sending panic through the room. The children pressed against the wall, holding their breath. David stood by the door, pretending to work, praying they would not enter. Every moment was risk. Every sound was danger, but still David kept his promise. One night, as he worked on the crystal device again, Lyra placed her small hand on his arm. Her eyes filled with fear. She whispered a word in her language, then repeated it in broken English. Hunters, coming. The others stirred, whispering the same word. Their voices were thin, trembling. David didn't understand all of it, but he knew one thing. The children were not just hiding from humans. They were running from something far worse. He looked at them, their eyes filled with both fear and trust, and felt the weight of his choice settle heavier on his shoulders. If the hunters came here, the station would not be safe. Not for him, not for them. And now the secret he carried was no longer just dangerous. It was deadly. The hunters. The station was restless. Whispers moved through the corridors like cold wind. People spoke in low voices, their eyes sharp with fear. Something was coming, something terrible. David heard it everywhere. At the food depot, in the repair bays. Even in the long line at the water tanks. The hunters are close. Ships seen near the rim. They'll come for us next. Nobody said it loudly, but everyone knew the truth. The alien hunters were not a rumor anymore. They were real, and they were near. David worked as usual, tightening bolts, patching leaks, fixing doors that refused to open. But his mind was elsewhere. In his workshop, hidden from all eyes, the children waited. He could not stop thinking about them. Every whisper about hunters made his chest tighten, because he knew something no one else on the station knew. The hunters were not looking for monsters. They were looking for the very children hiding in his workshop. That night, when the station lights dimmed and most people returned to their bunks, David slipped into his workshop. The door closed behind him with a hiss. The children were awake. Their wide glowing eyes watched him with worry. Lyra clutched the small crystal device to her chest. Another boy sat close by, his thin hands trembling. David tried to smile. "It's all right," he whispered. "You're safe here." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. The hunters were drawing near. If they searched the station, nothing would stay hidden. He sat with the children, watching them eat the bread he had brought. Their faces were tired, but when they looked at him, he saw trust. That trust cut deeper than any insult, deeper than being called a fool. For the first time in years, someone believed in him, and they weren't even human. The next day, alarms echoed through the metal halls. David rushed outside with the others, pretending to be just another worker. Through the wide station window, he saw them, massive warships floating in the darkness of space. Their shapes were sharp like blades cutting through the stars. The sight made the crowd gasp. "The hunters," someone whispered. Fear spread like fire. Mothers clutched their children, guards shouted orders, and merchants quickly closed their stalls. David stared at the ships, his heart pounding. He didn't need anyone to explain. He already knew. The hunters had arrived. That evening, he overheard soldiers in the docking bay. They spoke with cold certainty. "We know they're here," one said. "Reports of strange shadows in the lower decks. Aliens." "We'll sweep the tunnels," another replied. "Search every room. If they resist, we burn them." David turned away before they noticed him. Sweat rolled down his back. They were coming closer. The tunnels, the rooms, the lower decks, exactly where his workshop stood. He hurried back, his steps quick, his breath heavy. When he opened the door, the children looked up at him with frightened eyes. "They're coming," David whispered. "We don't have much time." The children spoke quickly in their own language, their voices filled with panic. Lyra pulled at his sleeve, shaking her head, whispering the word he now understood all too well. "Hunters." David crouched down to meet her eyes. "Listen to me. You must stay quiet. No sound, no movement. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, though her tears shone in the dim light. He hid them behind stacks of scrap metal and broken machines, covering them with cloth. He placed old tools on top, making the piles look like nothing more than junk. Then he waited. The footsteps came sooner than he hoped. Heavy boots against metal floors, voices outside, check every door. Don't miss anything. The sound grew louder until it stopped right outside his workshop. David's heart hammered in his chest. He forced himself to breathe calmly as the door slid open. 2 soldiers stepped in. Their eyes scanned the room, sharp and suspicious. "What's in here?" one asked. "Scrap," David replied, his voice steady. "Broken machines." "Nothing more." The soldier walked forward, kicking at a pile of parts. The children were hidden just behind it. David clenched his fists, ready to act if needed, but the soldier only grunted. "This place stinks."
"Why waste time here?"
The other shrugged. "Because orders said every room." Their eyes narrowed at David. "You live alone?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Nobody wants to stay with a fool like me?" He gave a small, bitter smile. The soldiers smirked, shaking their heads. Pathetic, finally they turned and left. The door closed. David leaned against the wall, his legs weak. The children crawled out slowly, their eyes wide with terror. Lyra gripped his hand tightly. "It's all right," he whispered again, though his voice was shaky. "They didn't find you." But he knew this was only the beginning. That night, as he tried to rest, the station echoed with fear. Guards prepared weapons, officers gave strict orders, and whispers filled the air. The hunters were here, and they would not stop searching. David sat in his workshop watching the children sleep. Their faces looked peaceful, but their breaths were shallow, uneasy. He thought of the soldiers' words. Burn them. He could almost see it. The soldiers dragging the children out, the crowd cheering, the ships opening fire. David clenched his jaw. No. He wouldn't let it happen. He might be just a mechanic, a fool in the eyes of others. But he had made a promise, and if the hunters wanted these children, they would have to go through him first. The chase, the hunters did not wait long. The day after their ships appeared, the station changed. Soldiers filled the corridors. Patrols searched every floor. Loudspeakers barked orders telling citizens to remain calm, but fear was everywhere. David knew the walls were closing in. He heard boots marching above his workshop, saw scanners sweeping the air ducts, and watched guards question anyone who looked nervous. The children had no chance if they stayed here. That night, when the station lights dimmed, David gathered them close. Their glowing eyes shone in the shadows, waiting for his words. "You can't stay here anymore," he whispered. "The soldiers will find you. We must leave." The children whispered quickly in their language, fear rising in their voices. One boy shook his head, clutching at David's sleeve. Another pointed at the walls as if to say there was nowhere to go. David crouched, meeting their frightened eyes. "I'll get you out, I promise, but you must trust me." Slowly Lyra nodded, and one by one the others followed. David's plan was madness. His workshop sat near the old maintenance tunnels, passages most people forgot about. If he could lead the children through those tunnels, they could reach the lower hangars. And in those hangars, there were ships. Old ones, broken ones, but maybe one still worked. He began at once. By day, he worked as usual, pretending nothing was wrong. By night, he fixed an old shuttle hidden under a tarp at the edge of the hangar. Its engines were weak, its controls outdated, but David's hands were steady, his mind focused. Piece by piece, he brought the dead machine back to life. The children helped as best they could. They carried tools, fetched water, and whispered warnings when patrols drew near. Their small bodies moved like shadows, silent and careful. Every sound outside the hangar made David's heart race. If anyone saw them together, it would all be over. The danger grew sharper each day. Soldiers began sweeping the tunnels with scanners. Twice David barely avoided patrols. Once he pressed against a cold wall with two children hidden under his coat as soldiers marched past, their flashlights sweeping inches from his face. Another night, as he worked on the shuttle's wiring, he heard voices in the hangar. A group of men laughing. One of them was his co-worker, a bitter man named Crane. Crane had always mocked him. "David the fool," he used to say. Now his laugh carried the same poison. "I heard rumors," Crane said. "Aliens in the lower decks. Maybe our little mechanic friend knows something. He's always sneaking around." The others chuckled. "If he's hiding them, he's dead." David froze behind the shuttle, his hands trembling. He knew Crane well enough. If he suspected anything, he would tell the soldiers. Not out of duty, but for the pleasure of seeing David punished. That night, David moved faster. There was no more time. At last, the shuttle was ready. Its engines purred weakly, its lights flickered, but it could fly. David gathered the children. "Tonight," he said. "We leave tonight." They followed him through the maintenance tunnels, their small feet silent on the metal floors. Every step echoed in his mind like a drumbeat of danger. He carried the youngest in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. The tunnels twisted and turned, dark and damp. Pipes dripped water, shadows stretched long. David led them carefully, stopping often to listen. Behind them, the station groaned with the weight of soldiers searching. Then came the sound he feared, boots in the tunnels. Voices calling orders, "Search here. Don't let them escape." David's blood ran cold. They had been discovered. He pushed the children forward. "Run," he whispered. Quiet, but fast. The group moved like ghosts, but the hunters were quicker. Flashlights sliced through the dark. Shouts echoed. "There! Movement!" David's heart pounded. He turned down a side tunnel, pulling the children with him. Pipes hissed overhead, steam clouded the air. The sound of boots grew louder, closer. At one turn, they nearly collided with a patrol. David grabbed a piece of scrap metal and hurled it down the opposite corridor. The noise clanged like thunder. "Over there!" The soldiers shouted, running toward the sound. David didn't waste a second. Go, he urged, pushing the children forward. They reached the hangar at last. The shuttle waited, its hatch open. But the soldiers were close behind. David lifted the smallest children inside, his hands shaking. Lyra pulled the others up, whispering encouragement in her soft, broken English. The sound of boots filled the hangar. Soldiers poured in, weapons raised. Stop! Step away from the ship. David turned, his body blocking the hatch. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady. You'll have to shoot me first. The soldiers sneered, weapons glowing. But David was ready. His hand hovered over the shuttle's control panel. Behind him, the children waited, their glowing eyes filled with trust. He pressed the ignition. The shuttle roared to life, its engines screaming in protest. The sudden blast of light and sound shook the hangar, throwing soldiers off balance. The chase was not over. It had only just begun. The betrayal. The shuttle's engine screamed, filling the hangar with fire and noise. Soldiers staggered back, covering their faces from the sudden blast. David used the moment to push the children inside. Strap in, he shouted. Though the words meant little to them, his hands moved quickly, pressing switches, forcing the shuttle to respond. The machine shook like a dying beast, but it lifted slowly, rising on weak thrusters. The soldiers recovered fast. Weapons flashed, bright bolts slamming into the hull. Sparks flew, smoke filled the air. The children screamed. David gritted his teeth, steering the shuttle toward the hangar doors. Come on, old girl, he muttered to the ship. Just a little higher. The hangar doors began to close. Someone had triggered the lockdown. The gap narrowed with every heartbeat. David pushed the controls hard. The shuttle roared forward, scraping the edges of the gate. Metal screeched against metal as the ship forced its way through. Then, with a violent lurch, they were free, out into the cold dark of space. Relief lasted only moments. Behind them, alarms blared across the station. More ships launched, sleek, deadly hunters, engines glowing red. They're coming, David whispered. The children clung to each other, their wide eyes filled with fear. Lyra looked at him, her small voice trembling. David, safe. He swallowed hard, unable to promise what he did not know. The shuttle was old, too slow to outrun the hunters. David knew it. He had seen their ships before, fast, sharp, made for war. His shuttle was barely holding together. Still, he pushed the engines, weaving through the stars. The hunters followed close, their red lights blinking like the eyes of predators. Warning, fuel low. The shuttle's computer croaked in its broken voice. David cursed under his breath. He needed a plan, fast. He turned toward the outer belt where chunks of rock floated like drifting ghosts. Asteroids. Dangerous, but better than open space. If he could lose the hunters in the rocks, they might survive. The shuttle dove into the belt. Stones of every size spun around them, some as small as fists, others as big as mountains. The hunters followed, their ship slipping easily through the deadly maze. David swerved left, then right, narrowly avoiding collisions. Each turn rattled the shuttle. Each strike of a pebble against the hull sent sparks across the cabin. The children cried out, clutching each other. David's knuckles turned white as he gripped the controls. But the hunters kept coming. And then, betrayal struck. A voice crackled over the comms. One David recognized at once. David, I knew it. It was Crane, the bitter co-worker who had always mocked him. His tone was sharp, full of triumph. You're hiding them, aren't you? Those alien brats? I told the soldiers. I told them you couldn't resist playing the hero. David's chest tightened. So it was true. The soldiers hadn't just stumbled close. Crane had led them straight to him. Why, Crane? David growled into the comms. Why? Crane laughed. Because you're a fool. Because helping aliens makes you weak. And because now I'm the man who delivered them to the hunters. I'll be rewarded. You'll be nothing. Static filled the line as Crane cut the channel. David's jaw clenched. Betrayal burned hotter than fear. The soldiers hadn't found him by chance. They had hunted him with Crane's words. The children sensed his anger. Lyra reached out, her tiny hand brushing his arm. David? Not fool, she whispered. The simple words steadied him. He breathed deep, forcing his hands calm. No, he said softly. I'm not. The hunters closed in, their ships darting through the rocks like wolves circling prey. One fired, a bolt of energy striking the shuttle's side. The ship lurched, alarms screaming. Shields failing, the computer croaked. David guided the shuttle between two spinning boulders. The hunters followed. Another shot grazed the wing, tearing metal. The shuttle spun wildly. David fought the controls, sweat dripping down his face. He saw one chance. A narrow passage between two massive rocks. Too tight for hunters to risk, but maybe just wide enough for his broken ship. "Hold on," he shouted. The shuttle shot forward. Sparks rained as the hull scraped stone, metal tearing under pressure. The children screamed, the hunters hesitated. The gap was too narrow, the rocks too unstable. One tried anyway, but the stone shifted, crushing the ship in an instant. The explosion lit the darkness, scattering debris. The others pulled back. For now, they were safe. The shuttle drifted out of the belt, its engines coughing, its hull scorched. Inside, silence filled the cabin. The children clung to each other, trembling. David's chest heaved with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. He had betrayed nothing. He had chosen to fight even when others sold him out. Crane's words echoed in his mind. "Fool." David looked at the children, fragile but alive, and shook his head. "No," he whispered. "Not a fool. Never a fool. The hunters would come again. Crane would keep feeding them." But David was ready. He would protect these children until his last breath. The sacrifice. The shuttle limped through space, wounded and slow. Its engines rattled, sparks flew from broken wires, and the warning lights glowed a constant red. Inside, the children huddled close, their glowing eyes wide with fear. David's hands shook on the controls. He had guided ships before, but never under such pressure. Every beep, every alarm was a reminder. The shuttle would not last much longer. Behind them, the hunters regrouped. Their sharp black ships glided like predators in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They had not given up. They never would. David knew it. He had bought time, nothing more. The children whispered together in their strange tongue. Their voices were soft, urgent, and filled with fear. Lyra turned to him, her small hand gripping his arm. "David," she said, her broken English trembling. "They not stop." David looked into her eyes and nodded. "I know." He checked the fuel gauge, almost empty. The shuttle had minutes left, maybe less. Escape was impossible, but the children, he could not let them fall into the hunters' hands. He thought of Crane's sneer, of the soldiers' cold eyes, of the crowd that would cheer if these kids were dragged away. "No," he muttered. "Not while I'm alive." The hunters drew closer. Their comms crackled through the speakers. Harsh voices, sharp commands, words in a language David barely understood. But the meaning was clear: surrender. Hand them over. He switched the comms off. He would not listen. The children clung to him, their small bodies trembling. Some wept silently. One boy buried his face in David's coat, hiding from the truth. David's chest tightened. He was just one man. A mechanic, not a soldier. But these children looked at him as if he were the only shield they had left, and maybe he was. The hunters fired. Bright energy bolts streaked past the shuttle, shaking the hull. One strike hit the rear, exploding in sparks. The cabin filled with smoke. The children coughed, eyes wide with panic. David grabbed a fire extinguisher, spraying foam across the flames. His lungs burned, but he forced a smile. "Still flying," he said hoarsely. "We're still flying." But he knew it couldn't last. He made a decision then, one that tore at his heart but left no doubt. He would draw the hunters away. He would buy the children time. And if it cost him his life, so be it. David knelt before Lyra. He placed his hands on her shoulders, looking into her glowing eyes. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You must lead them now. Do you understand? You're strong, stronger than you know." Tears welled in her eyes. "No, David, come." He shook his head. "If I stay, you live. If I leave, you die. There's no choice." The children shook their heads, crying out, but David stayed firm. He guided them toward the rear hatch where an emergency pod sat waiting. Small, hidden, barely functional, but enough to carry them away. He pressed the activation panel. The pod door hissed open. "You go," he whispered. "Find safety. Find your people. Live." The children clung to him, refusing to move. David's throat tightened, but he hardened his voice. "Go, now, that's an order." Lyra trembled, then slowly nodded. One by one, the children climbed into the pod. Their glowing eyes never left him. The hunters fired again. The shuttle shook violently, alarms screaming. Time was gone. David sealed the pod door. Through the small window, he saw the children pressed against the glass, tears streaming. He gave them one last smile. "Not a fool," he whispered. A protector. Then he slammed his hand on the launch button. The pod shot away, vanishing into the darkness, too small for the hunters to notice. David turned back to the controls. Alone now. The cabin silent save for the groaning of the dying ship. He faced the hunters head-on. Their ships closed in, forming a deadly circle. Lights glowed red, weapons aimed. David gripped the controls, his face calm. Come on then, let's finish this. He pushed the engines to maximum, driving the shuttle straight toward the nearest hunter ship. The alarms screamed, metal tore apart, but he did not slow. The hunters fired. Bolts slammed into the hull. Still he did not turn. Closer, closer. At the last moment, David triggered the shuttle's reactor overload. Lights flared, energy surged. The shuttle exploded in a blinding wave of fire and light. The nearest hunter ship was torn apart, its pieces scattering through the stars. The others pulled back, caught in the blast. Far away, inside the small pod, the children saw the explosion. Their faces pressed to the glass, tears falling silently. Lyra held the crystal device to her chest, whispering his name. David. The pod drifted on, carrying them to safety. The man they had called a fool had given everything so they could live, and in that sacrifice he became more than a mechanic. He became their hero. The hero. The stars stretched endlessly around the small escape pod. It drifted quietly, carried by momentum, nothing but darkness and silence all around. Inside, the alien children huddled together. Their faces were pale, their glowing eyes filled with grief. They had watched David's shuttle vanish in fire. They had seen the hunters torn apart in the blast. And though the pod carried them to safety, their hearts felt heavy. He was gone. The man who had protected them, the man who had chosen them over his own life. Lyra pressed the cracked crystal device to her chest. Her voice trembled as she whispered his name. David. The others repeated it softly, as if afraid to forget. In their language, they spoke words of mourning, but also of hope, because David had not died in vain. He had bought them a chance to live. Days passed. The pod drifted until it reached a small green planet, hidden in the shadow of the outer belt. Sensors beeped, signaling life below. With the last of its power, the pod guided itself into the atmosphere, burning bright as it cut through the skies. The children held on to each other, frightened but hopeful. The pod struck the ground with a crash, sliding across soil before coming to rest in a field of tall grass. Smoke rose from its sides. The hatch hissed open and the children stumbled out, gasping at the air. It was warm, fresh, real. For the first time in days, they felt the ground beneath their feet, soft and alive. Shapes appeared in the distance, tall figures moving quickly toward them. The children froze, unsure if these were enemies or friends. But when the figures came close, the children's eyes filled with tears. They were their people, survivors of the hunters, hidden on this world. Adults with the same glowing eyes, the same faint blue skin. The reunion was immediate. The children ran into their arms, sobbing, speaking in hurried words. The adults held them close, whispering comfort. And then the children began to speak of David. The survivors listened in silence as Lyra told the story. She spoke in broken words, mixing their language with fragments of English. She told them of the human mechanic, the fool others mocked. She told them how he gave food when they were starving, shelter when they were hunted, how he fixed their broken crystal, how he risked everything to save them, and finally, how he sacrificed himself so they could escape. The adults bowed their heads. Some wept quietly. Others lifted their eyes to the stars, whispering words of honor. In their culture, sacrifice was sacred. To give one's life for children was the highest act of courage. David, one of them said softly, not fool, protector, hero. The word spread among them, hero, hero, until every voice carried it like a prayer. That night, under the alien sky, the survivors built a fire. They gathered around it, the children in the center, telling the story again and again. Each retelling made David's image stronger, no longer just a mechanic, no longer just a man, but a symbol. They carved his name into stone, placing it at the edge of the fire. The children placed the cracked crystal beside it, glowing faintly in the night. Lyra whispered, "He saved us all." The others repeated her words, their voices rising like a chant. He had given his life so the children could live, and because of that, their people would endure. Far away, back on the space station, rumors spread. Soldiers spoke of a fool who had stolen a shuttle, fighting hunters until the end. Citizens whispered of an explosion in the stars, of hunters destroyed by one man's courage. Even those who had mocked David began to speak differently. The word fool was replaced with something else. Hero. They never knew the full story. They never knew of the children. But the legend grew. A simple mechanic who stood against hunters. A man who chose kindness over fear. And though they had not believed in him before, they could not deny what he had done. On the green world where the children lived, his story grew even larger. They passed it to one another, child to child, parent to parent. They remembered the human who gave them hope. They taught his name as if it were sacred. Generations would pass, but the story would remain. The man who was called a fool, the man who chose to protect, the man who saved them all. As the fire burned low, Lyra sat quietly, staring at the stars. Somewhere out there, among the endless dark, David's spirit lived on. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering softly, "Not fool, hero," and the stars seemed to shine brighter as if agreeing.